Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great honor for me to be chairing such a distinguished panel. I have two former Prime Minister as well as the first ever European Council President, and Irene Tinagli, our MEP, Daniel Gross, our Director, and Simon Hicks, who is a leading expert in European politics. But for the time being, I will just introduce Professor Mario Monti. And we all know him because he has contributed so much to this university, first as a professor, then as rector, as a president of both the university and now of the Bocconi Institute, and also as honorary president and force behind the creation of the IEP, which we are celebrating today. Perhaps even more importantly, President Monti's contribution to European integration cannot be overestimated. He contributed both directly in his role as Commissioner for Internal Market and then for Competition and Italian Prime Minister, and indirectly in his capacity as a commentator and writer. In his latest book, Demagonia, President Monti retraces much of our recent history with a surgical eye in identifying the problems that plague our contemporary democracies, what he calls demagony, the agony of democracy. As it is to be expected from a person who has long been a supporter of European integration, his analysis is not limited to domestic problems. He identifies a worrying drift in European governance, one where the European Commission President gives way to sectoral and domestic demands in order to be re-elected, one where the European Council acquires more powers and with those shifts the European vision from long-term to dangerously short-term to please national electoral cycles. And as Mario notes, whereas the changes in institutional balance might not be of great interest to citizens, they might have a real impact on the quality of the output, the quality of the decisions that the EU takes through its institutions, and so for us all. So I cannot think of a better person than to introduce us to the topic of our panel, how to improve the EU governance to serve more effectively the general community interest, than Professor Monti, and I leave you the floor. Thank you very much, Mario.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. It's a great honor for me to take the floor in the context of this annual event, and this provides me with an overdue opportunity to thank the leadership of Bocconi, President Cironi in the first place, for having manifested the intention and followed up concretely to follow in the Bocconi commitment to which I've been always so strongly attached of studying European integration and when circumstances call, work for European integration. I think it is very much in the spirit of IEP to dwell also on topics which are normally considered slightly untouchable because they are too august, too high level, well beyond the reach of normal critique. But I think the issue of the EU governance, in order to pursue better the general interest of Europe, underlined, is one that we all have a duty to consider, including the most upward, elevated aspect of that, which is the European Council. And we have the unique privilege today of discussing also the European Council with the contribution of Herman Van Rompuy, the first elected permanent president of the European Council and the president of the Euro summits. He had to interpret that brand new institutional role in war times, because it was at a time when the Eurozone was under unprecedented tensions. So, especially because President Van Rompuy has not been speaking publicly too often in recent years, I am sure that his reflection at Bocconi today would be of greatest importance. Now, scholars are doing a lot of work on the evolution that is taking place in the role of the European Council. They speak of new intergovernmentalism, new institutional leadership, and so on. I'm not in a position to take part, bringing a value added to that discussion, which is very interesting. But in my view, what is lacking is to combine the institutional analysis with the political analysis of whether such evolutions that the European Council is displaying over time, whether such evolutions bring about a higher or lower risk that nationalism permeates the whole process of European integration. I believe that there is a huge risk for this. Why? Because the increasing role of the European Council among the EU institutions, including the Commission, is taking place at a time of increasing nationalism. And I have the impression not just increasing nationalism in the actual formulation of policies by member states, etc., but that brings with it a perceived increased respect and decency for nationalism, which did not used to be there 15, 20 and more years ago in community life. Many years ago, if a commissioner was in fact a bit bending towards the national interest of some country, maybe his or her own country, that might happen occasionally, but was preserved in a curtain of discretion. Today, it is almost claimed loudly, because this is something that the national constituencies expect from a commissioner. So this is really a change in the acceptability of the nationalistic currency. And of course, the European Council is, by construction, by definition, the place where the heads of states and governments meet. So we cannot be surprised if there is a strong accent on their national interests, except that they meet not in a conference of their own, they meet in one of the bodies of the European Union, which has a top role in the formulation of the policies of the European Union. So they go there as heads of their respective governments, but maybe something that would remind them, as well as the public opinion, that it's a body which is different from others. And they have a bit of Europe-wide responsibility when deliberating there, would not be totally out of place. And in my observation, since the European Council has become the top floor in the hierarchical architecture of the EU, the increasing degree of nationalism manifested by many governments, mind you, not just sovereign governments, permeates in a top-down way the mindset of those operating on lower floors, particularly commissioners and directorates general. This endangers especially the role of the Commission as guardian of the treaties. Also, this has the rarely noticed, but in my view fundamental, drawback of exporting to Brussels some features of how national politics functions these days, features which are probably at the origin of the agony of democracy that is threatening several countries. When I was many years ago commissioner for 10 years, I remember that maybe because I had never done politics before in my country or elsewhere, I did not suffer of an inferiority complex that most commissioners suffered. Maybe it was a wise complex to have. That is an inferiority complex vis-à-vis national politics. I remember that if one day or the other an Irish referendum turned negative, maybe by 40,000 votes, within the College of the Commissioners, a painful, sadomasochistic exercise of self-flagellation started, and we saw ourselves as necessarily the cause of that failure of Europe. I was among those, very few, who thought that maybe there was something increasingly wrong in national politics everywhere. For example, an increasing short-termism or an increasing unawareness or unwillingness to take into account the transnational dimensions of most problems. The fact is that most of my colleagues felt it natural to remember with nostalgia the day that they were prime ministers or ministers in their home country before being expelled to the Commission, or were looking with hope to the moment when they might be big players in their national politics. I am so distorted that I have always thought that an important responsibility in the European Commission, for example, is more important, more rewarding than a very high level in national politics. So, for those who, and in a book Sylvie Goulart and I wrote back in 2012, in the few moments that President Van Rompuy left me free of meetings of the European Council and Euro summits, we wrote that it was probably the increasing ineffectiveness and distortions and lack of transparency and lack of honesty in the several national politics, which was polluting the European political process, which so far had been a bit more naive, less Machiavellian, and more geared towards the construction of an incredible new edifice to which each head of government, each time they went to Brussels, were bringing a new brick. Since a certain moment, the EU has been seen by the heads of governments under increasing anguish because of the way in which they cultivated their electors domestically has been seen more as an opportunity each time they go to the European Council to take away one brick from the construction and to dissolve it in powder that may be useful domestically to find a scapegoat for the domestic political inefficiencies that is Brussels. So, sorry if I'm not sufficiently technical or sufficiently legal or sufficiently institutional, but in my view, the mood about how Europe is constructed and what the European spirit and reality is all about must be incorporated in this reflection. And I would very much encourage the Institute on European Policy Making at Bocconi to do a bit of this dirty job. For those who recognize that mounting nationalism, more than deficiencies in particular policy areas, on this I would insist, for those who recognize that it is mounting nationalism more than deficiencies in particular policy areas, which is the real enemy of EU as we would like it to be, able to decide, even able to implement what it has decided, unheard of, even building a genuine single market or becoming more competitive internationally. Well, yes, there may be, as recent reports, and we had a wonderful representation of the letter report this morning, specific policy deficiencies may have a big responsibility, but as Enrico underlined very often this morning, it is the erosion by nationalistic appetites, which, for example, to use his words, keeps national governments desperately wanting national authorities for financial markets or for telecoms, etc., etc. So we must be, I believe, even when studying and learning a lot from highly authoritative reports, be aware that we are not captured in a distortion. It's normal for European industry to be happy with reports that call for less bureaucracy, a loosening of controls, bigger size, and so on and so forth. The fact is that many people in industry would then encapsulate in a headline the recommendations coming from these reports, the headline being Europe, wake up. So what can the normal citizen in a member state feel when he sees authoritative people concluding hundreds of pages of very good analysis with the headline, Europe, wake up? That the responsibility of a non-single market, of a not competitive Europe, lies in Brussels. Whereas the meticulous analysis, case by case, in those very reports, shows that behind each fallacy in policies, there is a lack of willingness or ability by the European Union to attack those persisting nationalistic reflexes. But there is a body which has the institutional purpose of doing that, which is the Commission as guardian of the treaty. Now, the fact that the European Council has become so overarching brings even very strong presidents of the European Commission to genuflect a little bit, to consider with excessive deference that body, whose task is not to instruct the other European institutions. And in my dreams, I would like to see the European Commission coming back to a role whether it does not fear at all the reactions of member states to it doing properly and swiftly the job of enforcing the treaty, all the decisions of the European Council, for that matter, rather than being cautious, because then what happens at the next election of the European Commissioner, the President of the Commission, or what happens if big member states are disheartened. And I believe that, maybe I will conclude with this, that the present circumstances provide us, perhaps us who like European integration as it was originally meant, with a window of opportunity. And here, all of a sudden, I become pragmatically political. Consider the following. We have a re-elected President of the European Commission who has, whatever one thinks of her action in her first mandate, and most people believe that it was rather effective in extremely difficult conditions. And she has displayed an enormously advanced set of skills to gain this re-election. Whereas on the previous occasion, she was brought there by two angels with very strong arms behind their wings, the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany. Now, those two executive powers are, unfortunately for us all, at a minimum in the diagram of their power and effectiveness. She is at a maximum. She is experienced, maybe too much, judging from the way in which she has skillfully played with the competences of the commissioners so as to make sure that the last word will be of the President of the Commission. But at any rate, she starts from a very strong position of power internally and externally. At a time when national governments, one should say, except perhaps the government of a country which in the past was the quintessence of weakness, i.e. the Italian government, are very weak on average, especially those of the two countries which are, there is no more important country in Europe, but let's say normally the most influential governments, France and Germany. And she has to confront, President Van Rompuy will perhaps tell us whether that is the appropriate verb of the relationship between the President of the Commission and the President of the European Council, a newly elected and therefore unexperienced in that particular role, President of the European Council, former Prime Minister Costa. Maybe, and he is preceded by a reputation of being pretty strongly in favor of a correct process of European integration, not dominated by this or that country, and giving the appropriate role to the community method, not just to intergovernmentalism, whether old or new. Maybe they could find a modality of operating in a very constructive way, not undermining the European Council at all. I remember some long hours during the day, but most often during the night, reaching Herman 4:30 in the morning, when under his chair we solved some of the most thorny problems for Europe, but they could work together, and the new president of the European Council could also maybe consider some soft measures, but not without effect, I believe, on the decor and discipline of the functioning of that august body, for example, through a code of conduct, including the modalities of communication, so as not to confuse Europe about so-called final decisions of a European Council, of which 27 members give their own 27 interpretations. And maybe, occasionally, some meeting in non-decision-making sessions. I remember, and this is really my last word, the day that towards the end of that potentially lethal way, which was 2012, in a meeting in Italy, President Van Rompuy and I came to the idea that it might have been good to devote one session of the European Council not to take this or that decision on Greece or Cyprus or Italy, but to consider whether a phenomenon which was brand new at that time, which people called populism, the rising populism observed in many of our countries, not yet labeled sovereignism, maybe could it depend to some extent from EU policies or from the way in which EU communicated its policies? Maybe yes, maybe not. So the idea, which was very much endorsed by Herman, was to call a session, I thought, in Italy, maybe in the room where the whole adventure started at the Campidoglio, maybe to pay respect to then outgoing President Napolitano. We thought he was outgoing, to have this discussion. But 2 or 3 days later, a rather strong man of the Council, Mrs. Merkel, called me, saying that she shared very much the idea that Herman and I had put forward, but that she would have liked, slowly goes in the German soul, that for sure to take place, but only once all the financial crisis had been definitively overcome. So I'm not sure that ever the European Council had that reflection. So I believe there is a lot to reflect on this body to make it more respectful of the Jean Monnet construction, more in line with the imagination of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt when they invented it, a body of giving the strategic orientation, and not a body gradually eroding with the decisions in the nitty-gritties, the exclusive powers of the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this very interesting and thought-provoking reflections. And I was thinking whilst you were talking about this shifting role of the European Council and the Council conclusions in July 2020 and December 2020 that were so detailed that lawyers are still thinking about whether they were okay, whether they were compliant with the treaties. These were the conclusions that set out Next Generation EU and then authorized Next Generation EU. But before opening the floor to a more general discussion, maybe we could hear from Herman Van Rompuy, which, as we said several times, was the first President of the European Council, has been Prime Minister of Belgium, and has held various government positions. He is currently a professor at Leuven and at the College of Europe in Bruges. But he was the first President of the European Council, which must have been terrifying and exciting at the same time, because it's a role that is described up to a point in the treaties. And what we know of the presidency of the European Council is that it is a consensus-building activity, and I think your role during those 5 years was very much towards that. And I like the quote of when you said that you thought about your own role as being neither a spectator or a dictator, but a facilitator. And I think those who followed on your steps have tried, not always so successfully, to be facilitators. But we would really like to hear your thoughts on our topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for being the very first time in my lifetime at the Bocconi University. It should be always a first time, and this is the first time here in Milan at the Bocconi, at the invitation of my good friend and former colleague, former Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti. And I prepared a very long speech, but I will try to shorten it as much as possible. For me, one of the root problems of also the EU institutions is what is happening inside each of our democracies and societies. I will not extend too much on this, but there is a crisis of our democracies and there is a crisis of our societies. There are many reasons for that. One is the rising individualization of our societies, the atomization that creates a fragmentation of the political landscape and governing national countries, member states, more and more difficult. I came from a party that was a ruling party. In that party, when I was president, had 33% of the votes in my region. Now it's at 13%. And the biggest party has an electoral result, and recently, an electoral result that we considered in my time as a catastrophic result. And that is now the biggest party in the country. So there is something happening in each of our member states due to a lot of changes in our societies. Again, it has to do with this rising individualization, and it has to do also with the lack of protection, or the perceived lack of protection against many threats in our society. And that's a fertile ground for populism, and it's a fertile ground also for nationalism. Populism is broader than just nationalism. Populism has deep-rooted grounds in our societies, and nationalism is one of the expressions of populism. Going back to the EU, because you have all those changes in our societies and in our political democracies, in the three institutions of the European Union, the Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament, you have some kind of translation of these changes in societies and democracies. You have this translation in the composition of those three institutions. Of course, the European Council, these are the prime ministers of the presidents of the different countries. If this governance comes in the hands of populists, then the populists are around the table in the European Council. We have now a few examples, going from the Netherlands very recently. Of course, you have Slovakia, you have Hungary. I will not speak of other countries not to become unpleasant and being in Italy. But you have the composition of the EU institutions is a reflection of the national realities, and there is a red thread all over Europe in the rising of populism. You have that also to a lesser extent, but you also, and it will grow will increase in the coming years and decades. You find this also in the composition of even of the European Commission. And of course you have it in the European Parliament. The two main political currents represent now a little bit more than 20% of the European Parliament. It is not 100%. Some give the impression that it's 100%. No, it's only 20%. But what you see is that also traditional parties, classical parties, are borrowing parts of the program of populist parties. And again, there are many very recent examples in big countries where on migration, on climate change and so on, you see the impact of the populist rhetoric and the populist ideas also transmitted to what we call center parties, traditional parties, classical parties. So these changes in each of our member states is translated in the EU institutions. And that we have to be fully aware of that, because the European Union is not a disconnected body, or not a disconnected architecture, disconnected from our societies. So it's in some way also the EU is also the sum of the member states. And if societies are changing, democracies are changing, mentalities are changing, then the EU is changing or affected by these new currents. I just said it is affecting the composition of the EU institutions, it's affecting also the policies of the institutions. Even look at the very recent tendencies on climate change. We had this bright idea, and it was approved by member states and by the Parliament of the Green Deal. But you see in the recent months, let's say the months before the European elections, that there were modifications, another tone, other priorities, also on the Green Deal, and it's not over yet, because you have to adapt on what is happening again in our democracies and our societies. That's my first remark. Too short, a shortcut, could be controversial, but not too much controversial, because in some way it is a description of what is happening. On the EU institutions, especially on the European Council, some are asking me what is the big difference with your time, as if I was president of the European Council centuries ago. It's only 10 years ago. One of the big differences is the role of France and Germany. And the role of France and Germany changed dramatically in the course of the time. In the beginning, you had too much Franco-German cooperation. Remember what was called the Merkozy, the Merkel and Sarkozy working too close together, even. Then it was not so strong with Hollande. Then you had the period afterwards. You had in May 2020, just a few weeks after the outbreak of the COVID, this major agreement between Chancellor Merkel and President Macron on this recovery fund of almost 800 billion. When they launched the idea, it was 500 billion, but totally in grants, no loans even. So the Franco-German motor played a big role in the history and even in the recent history of the European Union. This is not no longer the case, and that was we discussed it at the table. It was the great opportunity for the Commission President to jump in and to fill the gap, because somebody has to take the lead. There's, of course, always a structural handicap for the Commission, because they can make proposals, but at the end of the day, the member states and the Parliament afterwards, when it is about legislation, but let's let's only mention here the member states, have to approve. La Commission propose, le Conseil européen dispose. They fill the gap, but they have a structural handicap because they have the right of proposal, the monopoly of proposal, but somebody else has the final word. So this Franco-German motor is absolutely key, even if the Commission in the last period is playing a bigger role than expected and a very useful role. But again, I will repeat it, the composition of the Commission can change in the course of the years because they also are appointed by national governments in some way, at least the persons. What will happen if there is a major change in France in 2027? It could be that those populists who are moderate today, if they have around the table an extremist of a populist French president, I hope that it will not be the case, but let's assume that they are around the table with that one. It could be that those moderate populists become even more radical than today. So this is, the Franco-German motor plays a big role, but independent of what could happen in the future, because of course that will not be a change of leadership, that would be a regime change, also a dramatic change for the European Union. The Commission is independent, yes and no. She is not independent from the Parliament because she needs the approval of the Parliament. She needs the vote of confidence of the Parliament. A Commission can be in some way voted out. That what happened at some moment, not technically, with the Prodi Commission so many years ago, 15 years ago. So they... The Santerre Commission, okay, the Santerre Commission. I was too much thinking at my good friend, Karel van Miert, who was at that time in the Commission, and he told me many times the story of what happened with the Santerre Commission. So with this dependency of the Parliament is a real one. If the Parliament is changing in the more populist sense, then you can imagine what can happen in the future. So this is the Commission independent from the Member States? The President of the Commission is a member of the European Council. And if they put a proposal on the table, they have to anticipate the approval, the consensus that would be needed to in some way to make that their proposals become one day or another a reality. So this you shouldn't overestimate this independence of the Commission. They are dependent from the European Parliament, and the European Parliament is a reflection of the realities in a lot of member states. Some are imagining all kinds of reforms. The merger of the presidency of the Commission and the presidency of the Council. I have a good friend of mine, very pro-European, he died 10 years ago, Jean-Luc Dehaene. He was very much in favor of the merging, the double-hatting of the presidency of the Council and the presidency of the Commission. And I said, Jean-Luc, you think that the President of the Commission will become President of the Council. I think that the President of the Council will become President of the Commission. And of course, this is a big difference. You spoke about the two famous methods in the European Union. I know when you merge the jobs, I know what will happen. Another idea is you should give more visibility to the President of the Commission and let him or her be directly elected. Yes, but that is a good example of what is called a false good idea. It is a good idea because you have a stronger democratic legitimacy. It is a bad idea because if you keep the competences as they are, the day after there will be a big disappointment from public opinion. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, but it could be that you need a treaty change for that although some are telling me or try to convince me that you don't need a treaty change. So this, even if you embark on treaty changes, what is possible in the current context? Well, in 2010, I remember one of the first press conferences, we had just approved, no, the Treaty of Lisbon was entered into force, the 1st of December 2009, and some were already speaking about a new treaty. Never-ending story. He calls me, in the Belgian context, we are changing the constitution, or trying to change the constitution at least every 5 years. And I said at that time, I will die under the Lisbon Treaty, and I have not the intention to die soon. So I thought that this process of a new convention that took almost 8 years in the first decade of this century, repeating that exercise, good luck. So I don't believe that you should embark on a process of an overall totally changing the architecture of the European Union because you will not succeed. I believe strongly not in a change of the treaties, but a change in the treaties. In change in the treaties, and there are several good reforms that we can take. Of course, there are not minor reforms. When you change the unanimity rule, that is not a minor reform. But even then, you should be creative. Instead of saying, this qualified majority or unanimity, you can have something, I'm a Belgian, something in between. So that you shouldn't be blocked by one of two countries for major decisions. And so either, I don't think is the right approach, but even for that, you need treaty change. But I consider that as a change in the treaties when you are changing the overall architecture of the Union, then c'est un autre paire de manches, as some are telling us. Some are saying, and there is, of course, an intellectual truth in it, if you want a European Union that is performing better, having better results, because on migration, on climate change, on security and defense, on competitiveness, all those major problems, you can do it with the current rules of decision, with the current role of the institutions. To some extent, you can even accept the argument. The only other thing is, if you start changing the rules, you are opening Pandora's box. The Union is completely divided on major changes. And instead of unity that you badly need when we are almost at war at our borders, or helping a country that is at war. So when you have all those problems coming up, you need not unanimity, but you need a broad consensus. And then starting a process of institutional reform that will profoundly divide the Union, I don't know if it is the right moment to do so. And therefore I'm rather skeptical on a new convention and all the implications of all this. So we have to work, I think, the most of the time with the current institutions. Of course, all depends, and that's also we discussed when we are talking privately during lunchtime, all depends also on the persons. And I hope, sincerely, that the new President of the European Council will have a normal relationship with the President of the European Commission, as I had with President Barroso. We are not rivals. We are not rivals. We are at the service of a common cause, And I know that structural changes are much more permanent and than just what happened between 2 or 3 persons. I know all this. But in the current period, where so much is at stake, what can happen if there is an accident or a regime change in the United States? With all the implications of the Ukrainian war, and if the Ukrainian war is going in the wrong direction, it has a huge impact on the European Union, huge impact. So we are now in a very, I know that it is said on many occasions, but the upcoming period could be crucial. And so let's focus much more on what we can do in the current institutions and work with the persons that we have. And I am a good hope that between the President of the Commission and the new President of the European Council, there will be a good understanding. And they have a big task, because the Franco-German motor will not be re-established soon. In France, they can have a new government in 6 months' time or in 1 year's time, and they can have even an accent can happen in 3 years' time. So they have the obligation not to consider themselves as rivals. We have something that we are at the service of the European common cause, and that we shouldn't forget. So this is a moment of political courage, and I know it is easily said because you have this fragmentation of the political landscape in each of our countries, and political courage is now much more difficult than when you have at your disposal 2 or 3 big parties who represent broad currents of the public opinion. In the Netherlands, they have now 20 parties in parliament, 20 parties in parliament. And that you have not 20, but you have in most of the countries, you have a fragmentation of the political landscape. I often said, and then I stop, you have around the table 27 heads of state of government. Actually, you are not with 27. Actually, you are with 80 or 90 parties around the table. Because all those countries have coalition governments. And they have to get an agreement before they go to Brussels, and they have to debrief the parliament when they go back. And so you should, in some way, you have to find an agreement between not 27, but with a multiplicator of 3 or 4. I have lived that the Prime Minister is asking, I have to call my coalition government. Nothing that was very special. And I came back, I see it was one of my last council. Okay, let's go. And one said, I never forget that, I mentioned it also in the one booklet, not with memoirs, but with reflections on the period I was in office. He said, look, I agree with what you decide, you colleagues. At that time we were at 28. I agree with what you decide at 27. But when I go home, I will face a vote of confidence, I will lose it, it will be the end of my political career. But I say yes here. And she did it because it was a lady. She lost when she came back in her country, and another one was replacing her, and he did exactly the same as what she did. But he brought her to resign. And he changed very easily his mind. After that, he became then the new Prime Minister. And I never forget this story. We are around the table with many other players than just those who are physically present in the room. I keep it.
Thank you very much. Again, so much to think about, but I was wondering whether I could bring in Irene Tinagli, who is a member of the European Parliament and chair of the Committee on Economic and Monetary affairs at the European Parliament to have some thoughts on the European Parliament, since we have focused mainly on the Commission and European Council.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for these very insightful thoughts and for the experience. It is indeed now what we see in the Parliament is also this increasing fragmentation. So the number of political groups are increasing, the difficulties in having a majority that really shares the same view of what the project could be and what kind of bricks we can bring. I really like very much this idea of going to Brussels to build something that is of common interest. And it's true that now it's increasingly difficult for politicians to have this kind of approach. I like to think, because that's what I live every day, that of all the European institutions, especially vis-à-vis the Council, Parliament is still the place where most of the people still feel this European spirit and wants to give the European Union more power, more incisiveness, simply because this gives us a reason to live, to be there. So we are the ones that every time we have to negotiate, for example, for a new regulation, for a new European authority, we want these institutions to have the power, to have the resources to do things. Because otherwise, what are we doing in Brussels if we don't have the leverage? The problem is indeed when we have to negotiate everything with the Council, and we did see this increasing attitude of the Council of being afraid to give more powers to European institutions, to the commissions, or to a higher level, to lose their sovereignty, partly because of ideological reasons. We do have many governments in the European Union that are led by parties that they got into power with this kind of narrative. We want to take back the sovereignty, we want to have more power, we want Europe to do less. There were several parties in Europe that, we are just back from the European elections, that was their slogan. We want Europe to do less. So this is, many governments have this kind of mandate, and so the Council now is driven by this more fragmented nationalistic pressures. And so it's not easy for the Parliament, but also for the Commission, because we know that no piece of legislation can be approved without, in many cases, without even the unanimous consensus of the Council. And this gives the Council a lot of power vis-à-vis the Commission and vis-à-vis the Parliament. And this is the reason why sometimes the Commission, it's true that the Commission over time has started to be perceived as less powerful or incisive or strong in front of the Council, but also because the Commission knows that if they tries to push, they can get the reaction of the Council, and if they don't get the agreement of the Council, we will not achieve anything. So it's a sort of a vicious cycle. So everybody knows that the Council becomes the difficult institution where it's difficult to get European spirit or legislation be passed, and so everyone lower its ambitions. And this is a problem. This is a real problem, because it's a downward spiral where you lower your ambition, and then in the end, you fuel the anti-European spirit because you don't deliver. So I see this as a sort of a paradox, and nowadays I see many colleagues among the most Eurosceptics that accuse Europe not to be able to deliver, not to be able to do things. We are accused often you are not doing what is needed in foreign affairs or vis-à-vis the war or the economic crisis. But those are the same parties that when we try to do legislation that empowers the EU, they vote against. So it is very difficult to break this. And I don't know if it's a narrative, if it's how we can break this. Because it's true that sometimes when they get into power, they do the same thing that the people they were criticizing earlier, because they realize it's not so easy to do things alone. And, you know, and even if you manage to get back your sovereignty, you are still a small country and you need Europe. But then now the damage is done. I mean, this kind of dynamics in our democracy, in our member states, is ongoing, is ravaging. So it's not easy to bring back the narrative into a more, you know, into a path that is more constructive and gives more trust to the European institutions. So I don't have many answers, but what I know is that I'm very worried about what is happening, what will happen in the upcoming 5 years. Because now we have a commission, as Mario correctly said, where we have a strong personality in the person of the president. She's experienced, she knows how to handle things, she's strong, and this can be very helpful. But on the other hand, I wonder, what will happen to all these commissioners that don't have that kind of political leadership or strength? Who they will refer to? Their national governments with the nationalistic pressure, or the strong president of the commission? This is my worry. What will we see? So it's a question mark. We don't know what we will see. And what will happen when everything that the commission or the president will try to force to feed the council and the parliament, but then when it comes to the council or to the parliament, because we do also have a fragmented and difficult majority now in the parliament, what will happen if the most nationalistic will fight back and say, we don't want to go this way, this is your vision, is not ours. So my fear is that we may end up in a stall for the next few years until something very big happens, like we did in the past legislature. You know, we were forced with the two big crises, the COVID crisis, the war, and the energy crisis. We couldn't talk too much. We needed to act. And then we were creative. We went around the treaties. We invented the next gen, and you know, we found the legal basis. We did things unimaginable. But then we got stuck again. After we did this, everybody was scared about bringing this to the next level, was scared about recognizing that what we did out of the emergency mood actually was something that we should have been doing in a more structural way, because actually it worked. It worked. What we did during the COVID, the common debt, the next gen, the common effort, the common reaction, the vaccines, it worked. And people saw, and we had the peak in trust in the European institutions because people saw the European Union acting, not just talking and say, it's me, it's my dominance. And the trust increases, but then when we stop doing this, then the trust went down because people at that point were having expectations to say, why did you stop deliver? Why didn't you push it forward? And so we are disappointing because simply we are afraid of what the European Union can do if we are really united and if we really create a true union. So we need that kind of political vision. And I'm not sure if Ursula alone can take us where we should be. But I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Let's hope she can. But I would pass on to Simon Hicks, who is Steinrock Chair in Comparative Politics, to have your analysis, because this is what you do. You work on the relationship between citizens and institutions, and you look at what's going on. So,
thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, as always, with this great panel. And what I want to say actually fits very well with particularly what we've heard from Mario and Herman here. The way I think of it is, you know, the challenges facing Europe today is a sort of crisis of you call it a crisis of democracy. I see it as a crisis of politics. We've seen and I think it's a result of policy and political failure. And that policy and political failure is at least partly a responsibility of the EU, not solely a responsibility of the EU. And I think there's two sort of elements of this. One of them is the fact the EU is sort of failing to deliver, and a sense of the public and the sense of the politicians and a sense of the frustration, and we've heard it on the panel today about how difficult it is actually to make decisions in the EU system. It's becoming increasingly difficult. It's much harder today than it was in the past when we had fewer member states. Add to that political fragmentation, which means many governments are now coalition governments, fragmentation inside the European Parliament, fragmentation inside the Commission, if you think of the growing pluralism of the type of politics inside the Commission, all the checks and balances across the system. To get anything done, you need to get a majority in the Commission, you need to get consensus, close to unanimity as much as possible in the Council, you need to get a majority in the European Parliament. Then you've got all the checks of national politics and national parliaments and various courts. So it is actually very difficult to be a dynamic decision-making system. I'm not suggesting that we would want to push the EU towards a sort of Westminster-style majoritarian system. I might be British, I'm also European. I think the British system is terrible. But at least I think, if you think of a continuum, at one end is the sort of British majoritarian system. At the other extreme of these uber checks and balances is the European Union system. You can say that that's a good thing during a polity building process. If you're building a new polity, you need lots of checks and balances because you need broad consensus on what needs to be done, how a system is going to be built. But it is now built. Now it's about delivery. Now it's about actual normal politics and normal policy. It's not about fundamentally changing institutions or changing the policy powers of the institutions. The architecture has been built. Now it's about delivering once that architecture has been built. And there I think we really do need to think about how do we reduce those checks and balances on those institutions. So that's one side. The other side is, I think, the fact we are facing a real challenge in that most of the policy challenges in the world today are beyond the nation state. If you like, in the European context, they're European-wide policy challenges. Of course, we talk about security, we talk about environment, we talk about migration. Of course, they cross borders, that's obvious. But the other one is economics. Of course, even on economics, it is a continental scale policy challenge. Competitiveness in a global market, governing the European single market, which is a market on a continental scale. Yet politics remains local. We don't have European-level politics. So even if you could get these institutions to work, it's impossible to sort of create a mandate for actual policy change within those institutions. And if you go back to the first elections of the European Parliament in 1979 and you read about the debate at the time, what people were saying at the time is, we're going to have elections to the European Parliament and we'll create European-level politics, we'll create European parties, we'll create a mandate for European action. We've now had 10 rounds of European Parliament elections. They haven't done that. They are still what we call second-order national elections. They're European elections fought in the shadow of national elections. So then we tried to increase the power of the European Parliament. That didn't work. That didn't create European politics. Then we introduced the Spitzenkandidat model, and I was one of the big advocates for this, and I still am. That hasn't created European-wide politics. Why? Because national governments are mainly the gatekeepers of this process. They're resisting the creation of politics beyond the nation state, and so we are stuck. We're stuck with a set of institutions with lots of checks and balances. We're stuck in an equilibrium where politics is at the national level, but all the policy challenges are at the European level. And that, I think, facilitates this policy and this political crisis that we now face in Europe. And it's very difficult to overcome that. I agree with Herman. I don't think we should go around the treaty reform route. Yes, I would love to see a direct election of the Commission President. I don't think it's going to happen. Yes, I would love to see a merger of the offices of the Commission President and the European Council President. Again, I don't think it's going to happen. So what I would like to see is gradually starting to really build some politics around the Spitzenkandidat, to try and create real contest for political power for the Commission President, the one office in the EU that really has the monopoly on legislative initiative, that really has the potential to build politics at the European level. And I think von der Leyen in the second term is going to be very interesting. She has a mandate for policy change. She's proven herself to be a very powerful leader, and I think she now has the ability to run a more centralized commission. A lot of people are complaining about that. I think that's exactly what the EU needs, and I think there's very few risks given all the checks and balances that we have. The other element we've not really talked about, and I find very interesting, is the role of the European People's Party now in the EU institutions. The EPP are the dominant political force now across the institutions. They're dominant in the Commission, depending on how you count them, 14 or 15 commissioners. They're dominant in the European Parliament. They're pivotal in the European Parliament. Not only are they the largest group, they're in the centre of the Parliament for the first time. And they're dominant in the Council. And I think I would like to see the EPP, whether or not I agree with their politics or not is a separate issue, but that's irrelevant for me. What I would like to see is them build really party connections between the institutions. At the national level, political parties are the glue or the oil, if you work, that makes institutions work. They connect different institutions of government to allow politics to work. I would love to see the EPP build really powerful, closer connections between the politicians in the Commission, the Parliament and the Council to really try and set up their own agenda for Europe. If we don't like it, we don't like it. What I hope it does is create some politics, create some debate around the fact that, oh, do you like or do you not like what the EPP is doing? If you don't like it, get your act together and come up with an alternative agenda. Come up with a rival candidate in the next Commission President to the EPP candidate. Let's try and create real political contestation at the European level. That is my hope. I don't think the EU is going to work unless we can create some really genuine democratic politics at the European level. And I'll stop there and listen to what others have to say.
And now, last but not least, our director of the Institute for European Policy Making was previously also a distinguished fellow and member of the board of the Center of European Policy Studies, a Fulbright fellow and visiting professor at Berkeley, and a visiting researcher fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the EUI. Daniel, what are your thoughts about this? Will we manage to politicize in a healthy way the European Union?
We discussed that also in the lunch break, and my thought went to Acemoglu and Robinson, who just got the Nobel Prize today. And in their book, The Narrow Path, they describe that you need at the same time a state that can deliver and that is subject to checks and balances. We have more checks and balances than delivery in the EU. And therefore, as somebody who has never held any political responsibility, I still wanted to make perhaps some concrete proposals of what one could do, given the desolate state that all my colleagues here have described, of the absence of polity and the absence of a European feeling by the electorate. I still think that there's some opportunity to do something which will actually, by delivering and showing the public that the EU can make a contribution, that then one can foster also the European consciousness, right? It's always a two-way dynamic process. And first of all, I think some people have already alluded to that. The record is not that bad, right? Even if you look at the recent exceptional period, COVID showed that if you get together, then actually the public is also paying notice, right? And nobody lost his or her job because as a head of state, he or she agreed to the COVID package, which was actually not what was expected at the beginning, right? In Germany, for example, initially it was thought that this would be politically very risky, but in the end, I think everybody saw the political value added. And in a similar vein, but not the same, also the reaction to the full-scale war in Ukraine. It is, of course, perceived very differently in different parts of Europe. I think that's natural and natural. Even in the US, the perception of threat varies from state to state. But here, I think we have now a very strong not consensus, not everybody, but a very strong joint feeling that this is a question not just of our moral responsibility, but also of national interests. And if the heads of state and government feel that even their national interest is at stake in defending Ukraine, in defending Europe against Russian aggression and revanchism, then I think we have a basis to build on. And therefore, I would say, let's think about concrete steps that we could do to increase the feeling that Europe does deliver. And here I was thinking about things like in the field of defense. We have something which is called the European Sky Shield Initiative, which at present is perhaps a malfunctioning Germanocentric initiative. But if one could make it a European one, I think if European people see that, okay, we have a shield, something that defends us against missile threats, given what's happening all over the world, I think everybody would see the value added. The second concern is, of course, the external frontiers, migration, illegal migration. Here, again, we have an instrument, Frontex, which perhaps could be reinforced so that people have the feeling that there is a real value added of the EU in dealing with this, at least perceived threat. There's one area where actually I would recommend caution, and that's the economy. I remember too well when in 2000 the European Council said, we are taking control of the economy, and had the Lisbon agenda, and then in the end nothing happens. Why am I cautious on the economy as something where Europe, as Europe says, we are taking charge? Because in my view at least, most of the obstacles to more growth are at the national level. Completing the internal market, capital market, all of this will contribute. But the step from there to tell people, we EU guarantee you a better economic future, is in my view a step too far. And the risk of disappointment is too high. Again, it's not to say that the EU cannot do anything, it can contribute, but my narrative would be rather that we can contribute at the EU level, but making it more competitive, more open. But in the end, 80%, whatever, of your economic prosperity is made at home. But as I said earlier, there are other areas, as I said, external security, to some extent also internal security. Cyber attacks, that's another area where we have at least an embryonic EU body, which could be reinforced. And if in these areas where the EU really has an advantage, we concentrate our concrete efforts, I don't think the European Council will be an obstacle. And there we could create some instruments that would deliver visibly, perhaps small, but visible value added, that then at least gives us a chance also to strive for more political consciousness among the electorate that the EU is something that contributes to their quality of life.
Thank you very much then. Now, I would have lots of questions, but I'm very conscious of time. And I'm also very conscious that we have an audience. And what I suggest we do, because we have, not very much time, is to take a round of questions from the audience, and then maybe each of you could address some points. And I, for once, will not abuse my position as a chair, which is quite, it's not very often that happens. So do we have any questions from the audience? And we cannot see the audience. Yeah. There is one Vika, and then a person there.
Thank you so much. Fantastic and very interesting set of compelling addresses and very direct responses. I'd just like to ask a question to the panel. I'm not quite sure who would like to address it. To mention a line that that Mario Draghi raised after submitting his report several weeks ago regarding coalitions of the willing. In a sense that to get some decision-making momentum through, various member states could form their own kind of groupings. At lunch, I was reading a piece in the FT by Martin Sandbu, who put this idea across regarding the Balkan countries and the Nordics. We've heard about the capital markets, and President Enrico Letta raised the overlap between the frugals and the constituents in his address this morning, which I thought was very interesting. So just some thoughts. Do you think that there could be some merit in this idea, or do you think it could lead to the Balkanization of the EU and increasing the difficulties to get decision-making made at a European level? Thanks.
We had Vic and another question there, and then...
Hello all, thank you so much. It was really an honor to hear from such distinguished voices like you. There's a kind of a common theme across this panel to me, which seemed like the problems of nationalism, of the far right, of populism. And considering all of your backgrounds, I was just curious to hear if you could identify maybe one or two things that for you came positive out of this far right surge. How can you work? Of course, there are many negative elements, but there must be some positive elements. What can we hear as now trying to understand the European geopolitical stage, some positive far right elements that we can work with, trying to find a compromise in the context of European institutions, the European Parliament? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have a question there, please. Who was the first one?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this amazing panel. I have two questions very fast. One question is related maybe to what Professor Gross mentioned in his speech with regard to defense. I wanted maybe to hear all of your opinion. What do you think in terms of common defense inside the EU? Because as we see, Estonia, for example, Lithuania, they criticize sometimes some members of the EU, which are members of NATO, that they are not delivering on what they promise with regard to defense of Ukraine. They were not able to deliver more weapons than North Korea and Iran delivered to Russia. So what do you see on common defense? And second question is also related to this kind of idea of defense, because we cannot really build a secure Europe if you don't find a policy to deal with the Russian Federation. Because in his report, Mario Draghi, he mentioned China many times. Russia was not really featuring that much. But I think I really want to hear, what do you think Europe should do? Even if the war, Russia stops tomorrow in Ukraine, what do we do with Russia next? What would be the policy to deal with the Russian Federation, which has a very strong imperial policy towards its neighbors and in general? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So I'm very conscious that Herman has to go. So maybe if you have one last comment, and then we'll take views from the panel.
Excuse me, I have to take a plane, while I leave you in the good hands of my fellow colleagues of this panel. Just one word about what you and others have said. It's a political failure. No. It's a failure of societies. And of course, it's an intellectual exercise, but an intellectual exercise is not forbidden. And when you compare the EU institutions, they are complicated. But look at the American institutions. They are very simple, with one president and one parliament with two chambers, and is not functioning. It's not functioning at all. Even the judicial power is completely politicized. So we are complicated, it's difficult to make decisions, but other systems have their specific problems, and it's always referring to the crisis in many Western societies. But that's for another occasion that we can discuss it. Our problem is the following. We can take decisions, and you said it during your intervention. You can take decisions, but always in times of crisis. I said, with the back against the wall, the abyss in front of you, and the knife to your throat. Then we are very courageous. And happily so. Of course, it took a long period before we could manage the Eurozone crisis, but at the end of the day, we did it. The refugee crisis was stopped, the massive influx of people coming from Syria and the Middle East. You can discuss about the methods and whatever, but the agreement with Turkey and with other countries, okay. But it was stopped. If we hadn't managed that, that would have been a major crisis in all our member states, because there was no societal support anymore for receiving more millions of refugees at that time. We did it rather well, not in the beginning of the COVID crisis, but after some time, with the recovery fund, with the common purchase of vaccines, and so on. And even in the Ukrainian crisis, what we did in the beginning was unprecedented. The problem is how to take big decisions out of the context of crisis. You can say, yeah, we are always in crisis, so-called secular crisis, the permanent crisis. Okay, but let's putting that aside. But how can we take decisions in let's say, much more normal times? Then you have two kinds of methods. Either is in the European Council, some countries, or the Council as a whole, who take the lead. Say, look, and then the most easy example is, of course, France and Germany. They can say to their colleagues, look, we are not in a crisis, but we think that we have to do this, 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 and this. Don't forget that in the Eurozone crisis, after our famous Council, Mario, of June 2012, almost nothing happened afterwards. I published a report towards a genuine economic and monetary union, with a banking union, a fiscal union, an economic union, and even not a political union, but much more accountability. We realized only the first chapter, and in the first chapter, the banking union, the first part of it, the banking union. Since 12 years, almost nothing happened. Because emergency was there was not an emergency. When the emergency is over, it's the business as usual. And that can only be replaced by countries who say, look, we are not in a crisis now, but we have to do this, 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 and this. Please join us. If those countries are not doing the job, then the Commission can play a role. And that's what Ursula did for the Green Deal. There was not an immediate threat. Of course, the climate change is the biggest threat we have, but there was not a real opportunity, a real crisis moment. But the Green Deal was accepted by the Council, by the Parliament, and so on. Now, of course, it's becoming very concrete, then it's becoming more difficult. But you need people, you need countries who take our fate in our hands outside a situation of crisis. And that's why it's such a pity that you have in some of our member states, and it is a growing number, these internal problems that weaken the influence that those member states can have, and especially the bigger ones. And that's why the role of the Commission, even with the handicaps that I described, the structural handicap, because they have the right of proposal, but the right of proposal can be crucial in some periods. And we shouldn't miss that. So I'm putting my hope on the new people that are in place. Of course, we have big challenges ahead of us, and the force is to anticipate, so that we are prepared for a next crisis. In the crisis, I think if the crisis is big enough, we will manage. But we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait. But again, my problem is that it is a much broader issue than just focused on politics, on European politics. We are living in a much more complicated world than that. I have to apologize. I have to go back
for being with us.
to my hometown, to Brussels.
Safe travels. And we'll take only a couple of minutes more at the risk of being killed by the Sylvia of the situation. So maybe, Mario, you wanted to intervene on the point made by one of our...
Very quickly, but first of all, I would like to make sure, because I do not hear very well, to say the least, the reference to Martin Sandbu in the Financial Times, was it to really change the EU, the northern flank must take the lead? Was that the reference?
It's, there. Yeah,
okay.
It was.
Then I must say that I did read this article. I found it rather interesting because I believe that as regards competition and industrial policy at large in Europe, we are a bit orphans of the UK. Namely, it was easy to predict, and it was predicted, and it is a bit happening in my view, that with the departure of the UK, the Nordic countries, which on average have more sympathy for openness, structural reforms, accepting the challenges of globalization, than the more entrenched Franco-German, Italian, neo-corporatist economies, lost out. The North, the small countries in Northern Europe lost the big brother and the big ally. And I think that for all its huge merits, if there is a slight criticism that I would make to the Draghi report is that it speaks a bit to the world of yesterday in terms of large corporations, mainly Franco-German. Be careful with competition policy to the extent that it might prevent reaching the appropriate size, and so on. Now, these days, we see that the Justice Department in the US, after a long time of moderation in antitrust policy, is considering the untellable, namely, perhaps break up Google, doing what the Justice Department in the 80s did with AT&T. And many students of economic history will tell us that that strong antitrust action was the main cause of Silicon Valley, because it spread innovation over many, many companies. So I have some sympathies for this view, and I believe that Italy, it might be very strange, could a bit differentiate itself a bit from France and Germany by having some links with these more liberal Nordic countries.
Thank you very much. I'm told I wanted really just 1 minute on the far-right issue. I would like to...
30 seconds on populism. 30 seconds on populism. I think of democracy as a safety valve. So, you know, I don't agree with populist parties and I hate almost everything they stand for, but what have they raised? I think they've raised two issues that mainstream parties have had to respond to. One is individual and regional economic inequality. I think we've kind of ignored it for too many decades, and now it's back on the agenda as a main thing, and failure of public services. The other thing is migration. We've become de facto multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies. It sort of happened under the radar, and now we have to decide, we have to debate this openly. I'm still waiting for people to come up, stand up and make a positive case. We need to be multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies. We need migrants, but there's nobody yet standing up and making that case. And I think they will have to in response to populist parties.
Thank you very much. And Irene?
30 seconds on the coalition of the willing ones, because this is a strong debate in Brussels. Now, me coming from the Econ Committee, of course, is mostly related to CMU, Capital Markets Union. There is also these recent ideas that Spain is trying to put forward, the non-paper that I hope to be able to read soon. So the idea that if we cannot make it all together, let's start with the few ones that want to do it. Of course, being someone that wants to push things, sometimes you, out of frustration, say, yes, let's go. Who's on it? You know, 3, 4, 5. The thing is that it's not just Capital Markets Union. It could be defense, it could be... So what happens if on each topic you have a different coalition, and then you start having an European Union like a menu à la carte? You know, I decide I want to be in a European Union for CMU, but not on defense, but not on... So this would be not the progress of the European Union, but the end of the European Union. So I understand the frustration and the need to push, and I hope that it worked for the euro, for example. We started with a few, and now it's 20 of us out of 27, and it's working. But you can't use this recipe for everything. And now we are at a turning point where we need the European Union to be there, to be strong, and to be united on more than one front, because it's not just economic. So I hope that we will be able to move all the countries together. That's it.
Thank you very much. Daniel, do you want 5 seconds, or can we bring this to a close? No, I'm sorry, I don't think we have time to analyze the Russia.
I yield them to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I needed to close this panel. We could stay here another hour and a half, and I would have so many questions. But before we thank our speakers, I would like to thank again Silvia Colombo and Silvia Tesauro, because they did an amazing job in putting this together. They were greatly supported, and we're very thankful by the Events Office, and especially by Carla Bonomi, Laura De Valba, and Silvia Marzano. And again, thank you so very much. Of course, all of this would not be able to happen without the support of our university and our President Rector, the President of IEP, the Vice President of IEP, our Honorary President, and our Director. But thank you so very much, because this would not make sense at all without our students. So thank you all for coming. We know that you're very busy with your lectures and very, very tight schedules. So thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to all our speakers.